I'm going to be discussing what UCAT score you need to get into medicine this year and how you can get one, and why there's been some important changes this year that you need to know whether you're a student, a parent, or prospective UCAT taker in future years. Let's get into it. So the big news that came at the start of this year was that abstract reasoning was removed. The UCAT went down to 5 sections to 4, and now only the first 3 will contribute to your core score. Now, why was it removed? Well, the UCAT consortium had this to say. They said the abstract reasoning subtest has high coachability. Historical data on the subtest has shown that candidate performance has increased and response times decreased over the past 10 years. The nature of the subtest makes it more coachable compared to the other cognitive subtests. Now, what that means is people were getting coaching for abstract reasoning, and they were doing so much better than previously, in previous years when there was less coaching, that people got so good at the subtest that they had to have it removed. And in fact, a few years ago, you'd just get people, particularly with their abstract and quantitative reasoning, almost everyone who scored really, really highly was able to get 800 plus scores, even up to the 900s in those 2 subtests. But here's my question. Do you really think that someone who has coaching in any subtest won't do better than someone without? Is anything in life not highly coachable? Now, yes, abstract may be a extreme example where it's a lot easier to learn, but we all go to school, we all get tutoring, we all go, people who go to university. That is an example of coaching to improve in various things. And every subtest on the UCAT is coachable. Because if I tell you how exactly to do the questions, like the top performers do it, what to look out for in the sense, what common mistakes do people make? How do they try and trick you when they write the questions, and what you need to learn? If you know those 4 things compared to not knowing those 4 things, that is a dramatic difference. And I think obviously they can't get rid of the whole test, but getting rid of one subtest is a concession that this is still a coachable test. It's not quite the sort of IQ complete aptitude test that people once thought it was. And look, that has its pros and cons. But everyone I know who manages to study for it improves their scores drastically. And people who get tutoring and coaching for it do better than people who don't. And you can't say the same about things like IQ tests, right? The more times you do an IQ test, your IQ won't change. But the more times you do the UCAT, especially if you get coaching, the better your score will be. And that's just one of the inherent challenges with making an aptitude test for admissions to medical school, because people who sit the test will have certain strategies that they use, which they can then pass on to other people. So if you're a person taking the UCAT test this year, you need to know that this is a coachable subtest. How will you compete with people who are getting good coaching if you don't have access to these resources yourself? So what's a good score? Well, last year, because there was 4 subtests, it was scored out of 3,600. And this year, since abstract is gone, it's now out of 2,700. So no one can tell you exactly what score you'll need to get into med, or get an interview offer, more importantly. However, we can have a rough guess using the data from the past years. So last year, you needed a score of 3,060 to be in the 90th percentile, 3,180 for the 95th, and 3,350 for the 99th. Now, just pay attention to how clumped things are. Between 80 and 90, there's only 160 points, but that's 10 percentiles. Whereas between 95 and 99, there's 170 points and 4 percentiles. So to go from 95 to 99 is a bigger jump than 80 to 90. And that's because the UCAT scores follow a normal distribution. Now, what that means is most people are clustered in this middle. Most people will score around the hump of the normal distribution, which is why such a small difference in points corresponds to a drastic difference. Someone with an 80th percentile has very little chance of getting an interview unless they have other factors going for them. Whereas when you get to a 90th percentile, now you have a bit more of a chance. But even that is on the fringe, but only like 160 points might be 10 or so questions. And that's just the difference between having a good day and having a bad day. So what you want to do as a test taker is you want to escape the hump. You have to get to the upper part of the normal distribution where things get more and more spaced out, because then you have a margin of safety. then you can say, even if something goes wrong on the test day, you have a couple of unlucky guesses, you're still protected by this moat that the 95th to the 99th percentile have. Now, what I generally tell people is if we take the 95th percentile score, which was roughly what you needed to get an offer at basically every uni you wanted, and that's, let's say, roughly is 800 average per subtest. And we'll use that as the basis for some of our calculations today. But remember, each subtest is scored out of 900, and so 800 average is fairly high. So there's a few factors we need to consider when we say, is 800 average a good score for med? First of all, abstract reasoning was the highest scoring subtest. If you take off the highest scoring subtest and leave the 3 lower scoring ones, theoretically, the average score that you need should drop. On the other hand, because there's less subtests, people can put more practice and more time into each subtest, and hence people should get better at each subtest. And so theoretically, then the scores that you need should go up. A third thing to consider is that every year, the score you needed to get into med gets slightly higher, and it's often by 20 or 30. But if you compare the 99th percentile in the past, which would have been 3,200, to the 99th percentile now, which is 3,350, in 5 or 6 years, that's quite a big jump. And so particularly for people who are sitting the UCAT in next year or the year after, that's something to consider. The percentiles generally shift up each year. So if we take last year's 95th percentile, which was just under 800 average, and we say there's some factors that will make it a bit lower, there's sometimes some factors that will make it a bit higher. My general advice to people is, number one, we can't be exactly sure what score will get you into med. But number two, we want to aim for something, preferably at least 800 average. And so if we're thinking about a score out of 2,700, we want to be at least at 2,400 when you're doing your practice. Now, I always encourage people to shoot higher, to try and get as high as possible, but at the minimum, 100 points above. And that gives you a bit of buffer zone in case you have a hard test on test day, or there's things like exam stress and nerves, and you just get a bit unlucky. So it's good to have a buffer zone that you can use. Now, sometimes the scoring on Medify and MedEntry can be unreliable. So it's actually very hard to get this high a score on Medify and MedEntry, but you might still be getting a really good percentile. If that's the case, fill in the form below and I'll make sure I'll arrange a discussion with you to describe the nuances of scoring on Medify and MedEntry, because they change every year, but it's important that you know what your actual score is and not just your Medify or MedEntry score, which aren't necessarily correlated in the same way. Some platforms undershoot and give you an underestimate. Some platforms give you an overestimate. And so it's important that you know from someone who's had experience with both what your projected score is from your scores on Medify or MedEntry. All right, so let's say you need a score of 2,400 minimum, and you should probably be aiming for 2,500 out of 2,700. How do you get there? Well, there's 3 steps that everyone needs to take. And I think if you interviewed everyone who got in or got an offer, the majority, probably more than 90%, would have done these 3 things. Number one, you need a question bank. You need a high quality resource that times you per question and gives you data and feedback. The 2 most common are Medify and MedEntry. And so everyone who's sitting the test, if you don't have one of these, I feel like you're missing a trick relative to everyone else. There are other platforms, but I think Medify and MedEntry are the most popular. If you have another one that you find works well for you, that is okay. Second, do timed practice. Too many people are doing untimed practice, and that's costing them. The UCAT is a timed test. If you can get 100% untimed, it doesn't matter. It has 0 value. You have to be able to perform in timed conditions. And the way you do something timed is different to how you do something untimed. If I said you had 10 seconds to do a verbal reasoning question, as soon as the question pops up, you wouldn't bother reading the passage because you only have 10 seconds. You would just read the questions, read the question, read the answers, and maybe read the first line. So your strategy changes dependent on how much time you're allocated. If you had 5 minutes for a question versus 10 seconds, it would be completely different, which is why time practice is so important. Secondly, do long sets. Don't just practice in sets of 4 or 8 questions, because then you're at the mercy of the difficulty of the questions. You will do well if it's easy, and you'll struggle if it's difficult. So try and match the length of your practice to the length of the actual subtest. If you're practicing verbal reasoning, do 44 questions in 22 minutes timed. Number 3, seek expert guidance. Get advice from someone who sat the test before, who knows the strategies. And you need to ask yourself, if you did that, would it be beneficial? Would you do better if you did that compared to what you didn't? And is there any way you can get the time or money to organize that from yourself or from other people? And if the answer to any or all 3 of those questions is yes, do it now. The more time you have with this advice from experts, the better you will do because you have more time to incorporate it. And so, yes, there are people who do really well in the UCAT without any of these things, but you want to put the odds in your favor. You want to be in the majority, and the majority of people get advice from someone who's done the test before and done well. And even if it's a one-off session, they start with that. Now, if you're interested, but there's still some doubts, fill out the form in the description with your phone number, and I'll give you a call free of charge to discuss all of this in more detail and discuss any concerns that you have. I'm trying to help as many people as possible get as high a UCAT score as they can, because my passion is for helping the high achieving student who's still underperforming on their UCAT. Because I know there's many people out there who could be doing so much better, but with the right guidance, they need the right guidance to unlock their full potential. So please fill out the form in the description and keep this space open, because every week I'll be putting out new UCAT related videos, and these will be helpful into figuring out your strategy, changing your perspective on things, and giving you some motivation. So this is the place to be, and feel free to send me a message via the form or drop some comments below, and make sure you subscribe and keep this space open because we'll have some good content in the future. Thanks very much, guys, and I will see you next time.